My parents kept my older brother's mental illness a secret from everyone, and my mom said he was the only one she could tell our family's biggest secret to. When I confronted her about never keeping me safe from him, I discovered the real story was way worse than I ever imagined. I'm stuck in the middle with my big brother, Jack, and my little brother, Oscar. Jack and I are just 2 years apart in age, so when I was really young, I thought he was the coolest person ever. But it always hurt my feelings that he didn't seem to want to hang out with me. And our mom had hyperthyroidism, which meant she was extremely unpredictable. Sometimes she'd bring me to the park and was my best friend in the entire world. Other times she was barking orders at me, "If you don't clean this entire apartment, I will give you something worse to cry about." Is something she actually said once, when she caught me with my eyes watering from a dust allergy. But the more my mom abused me, the more I tried to be friends with Jack, until I gave up forever. On my 7th birthday, my dad bought me a bike. I rarely got to see him because he was working all the time, so him teaching me meant everything. My eyes were filled with a spark that only exists during childhood. So the next day, I asked Jack if he wanted to have a shot at it. When I saw his face light up, I thought I had finally said the right thing, but then he took it and ran it straight into a wall. Jack was fine, but my bike was completely destroyed. Jack came over to me crying, but instead of comforting me, or even just patting my back, he hit me and told me to shut the F up so mom and dad don't hear. I stopped trying to have a relationship with him after that, mainly because it was too painful. And a year later, Oscar was born. I decided early on that I wanted him to have a better childhood than me. So when he was old enough to understand words, I always made sure to give him the praise our parents never did. At 4 years old, he'd burst into my room wearing Jack's clothes and start randomly performing a fashion show. I'd clap every time and tell him how swag he looked. He had no idea I was lying through my teeth, lol. Because you know the awkward phase? The one where you just looked clapped 24/7? Well, Oscar's lasted until he was literally 16. It's honestly a miracle he wasn't bullied. But I don't even think he noticed how much of a loser the world saw him because of how well I treated him. Go me. But that's when Oscar and Jack stopped sharing a room together, and Oscar instead shared with me, because Jack had gone from being a slightly disobedient, horrible brother to a full-on abusive addict. One night he came home and instantly the entire apartment reeked of the devil's lettuce. With a megaphone, he started yapping at the top of his lungs. "Hey guys, how are you doing today?" Just garbage. You see, his strategy was simple. It was to keep my parents awake until they couldn't bear the sleep deprivation anymore, and hand over cash so he could buy more Dr. Asterisk G's. It was honestly awful. I always tried to shield Oscar from it, whether it was by putting earplugs into his ears or driving him to my friend's house. But either way, it was extremely distressing. And one time, when I came home to my mom putting concealer over a black eye Jack had given her, I decided enough was enough. I waited until my dad came home and cornered him in the dark hallway. I told him he needed to kick Jack out and get a restraining order, that he was scary and dangerous. And my dad was kind, probably the kindest one in the family. But he was also passive, the type to get robbed on the street and apologize for not having more money to give. So he just nodded, but months passed, and of course nothing changed. Then came the news that made me depressed for months. I had the opportunity to transfer to my dream college, one that was halfway across the country. I remember waiting until Oscar was asleep to cry my eyes out into my teddy bear, because going meant leaving Oscar behind, leaving him to deal with our family's BS by himself. But then I had a new thought. If I graduated and got a better job than I otherwise would have, then I could afford to provide a better life for myself and Oscar. A home away from home, so to speak. That morning when I broke the news, I expected his eyes to flood with a deep disappointment, to beg me to stay. But instead, his face remained completely stoic. "I'm really happy for you, Hannah." His tone was monotonous, same as always. I left home a few months later, and it honestly felt like I was abandoning my child or something. Me and Oscar kept in contact, and a few months later he told me Jack was in rehab, that everything was finally okay, and he was grateful for everything I'd given him over the years. Plus, he was in college too, so we were both able to get away from the noise. So when my friend said her sister was visiting LA, I told her she could stay in my family's apartment. Because while my parents had their flaws, being unwelcoming to strangers was not one of them. She thanked me profusely, and that was that. Or so I thought. She ended up staying in me and Oscar's room. And one night, Jack came home after relapsing, filled to the brim with alcohol and Dr. Asterisk G's. Suddenly, he flung a bedroom door open and he stole the innocence of my friend's sister. I found out about it 2 days later. My friend Melissa called me hysterical at 3 a.m. I was half asleep and couldn't understand what she was saying at first. Then it hit me like a truck. Her sister Amber had been assaulted by Jack in my childhood bedroom. I felt sick to my stomach. Literally ran to the bathroom and threw up. This couldn't be happening. Not in my family's apartment. Not to someone I'd promised would be safe there. The cold tile floor against my knees barely registered as I heaved until there was nothing left but bile and horror. I called Oscar immediately. He picked up on the fourth ring, sounding groggy. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone. Oscar confirmed everything. Said he came home from a late study session to find police at the apartment. Jack had been arrested. Amber was at the hospital. My parents were completely falling apart. I could hear the exhaustion in Oscar's voice, that familiar tone he'd developed over years of Jack's chaos, resigned, defeated, yet somehow still functioning. I booked the first flight back to LA, spent my entire emergency fund on that ticket. The whole 5-hour flight, I just sat there staring at the seat in front of me. An older lady next to me kept asking if I was okay. I couldn't even answer, just nodded and turned away. My mind kept replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Jack, searching for the moment where I should have seen this coming, where I could have prevented it somehow. When I landed, I took an Uber straight to my parents' apartment. The driver tried making small talk, but I couldn't manage more than one-word responses. The familiar streets of my neighborhood seemed alien now, tainted by what had happened. The place looked exactly the same but felt completely different. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table staring blankly at a cup of cold coffee. Dad was pacing back and forth in the living room, wearing a path in the carpet I'd played on as a child. Oscar sat in the corner, looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight. No one even noticed when I walked in. I dropped my bag on the floor and the thud made them all look up. Mom burst into tears, her face crumpling like tissue paper. Dad just stood there, frozen mid-step, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. Oscar ran over and hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. We all just stayed like that for what felt like forever. The familiar smell of home mom's lavender candles, Dad's aftershave, now mixed with something else, something sour and wrong. Later that night, after my parents went to bed, Oscar filled me in on everything. Jack had been in and out of rehab 3 times since I left. The success story Oscar had told me about was just to keep me from worrying. My parents had been enabling Jack the whole time, giving him money, letting him stay at the apartment between rehab stints. Oscar's voice was flat as he described how Jack would show up at 2 a.m., sometimes with strange friends, sometimes alone but clearly high. How he'd raid the fridge, blast music, threaten Oscar if he complained. I felt so stupid, so naive. I'd believed everything was getting better when it was actually getting worse. And now an innocent person was suffering because of it. Because of me. Because I'd offered up our apartment without knowing what was really going on. The guilt sat in my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. I remembered Amber's smile when I'd told her she could crash in my old room, how relieved she'd looked to have a safe place to stay while visiting LA. The next morning, I went to see Melissa at her hotel. The lobby was all bright lights and cheerful music that felt obscene given the circumstances. I'd never seen my friend look so broken. She couldn't even look me in the eye at first, just sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, her fingernails bitten down to the quick, tiny spots of blood on her cuticles. I didn't know what to say. What could I possibly say? Sorry my brother assaulted your sister? Sorry I told you our apartment was safe? The words felt inadequate, almost insulting in their simplicity. Melissa finally spoke after what felt like hours of silence. She told me Amber was pressing charges, that there was DNA evidence, that it was an open and shut case. Jack was looking at serious prison time. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt devastated. This was my brother, the same kid who used to build pillow forts with me before everything went wrong. The boy who'd cried when I left for college, clinging to my leg even as he pretended not to care. How had we ended up here? I asked to see Amber. Melissa said no, said Amber didn't want to see anyone connected to our family. I understood. I left a letter for her anyway, apologizing, offering to help in any way I could. I don't know if she ever read it. I sealed it with shaking hands, my tears smudging the ink in places. The next few days were a blur of police statements, lawyer meetings, and family fights. My parents kept insisting Jack needed help, not prison. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I screamed at them for the first time in my life, my voice bouncing off the walls of our small kitchen. Told them they were part of the problem, that they'd enabled Jack for years while I tried to protect Oscar from the fallout. Mom covered her ears like a child. Dad slammed his fist on the counter so hard a mug fell and shattered, coffee splashing like blood across the linoleum. Oscar just watched it all with those same stoic eyes. He'd gotten so good at hiding his emotions that I couldn't tell what he was thinking anymore. When I finally got him alone, I asked why he'd lied to me about Jack being better. He just shrugged and said, "You were happy at college. I didn't want to ruin that." His voice was so matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather instead of years of deception. I broke down crying. My little brother had been protecting me when it should have been the other way around. I'd failed him completely. Failed Amber, too. Failed everyone by leaving and believing things would magically get better without me there to fight for change. Oscar awkwardly patted my back, clearly uncomfortable with my display of emotion. He'd learned to shut down his feelings so completely that mine seemed to overwhelm him. Jack's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. I decided to stay in LA until then. Took a leave of absence from school, emailing professors with a vague family emergency explanation. Moved back into the apartment temporarily, sleeping on the couch because I couldn't bear to be in my old room. The room where it happened. I couldn't even look at the door without feeling nauseated, imagining Amber's terror, Jack's violence. Every night I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, watching headlights create moving shadows as cars passed outside, wondering how we got here, how my brother went from the kid who broke my bike to someone capable of such violence. I kept thinking about all the warning signs I'd seen but ignored or minimized. The hitting, the yelling, the manipulation, the escalating behavior that everyone just accepted as Jack being Jack. The time he K***ed Oscar's hamster and claimed it was an accident. The girlfriends who stopped coming around suddenly, who wouldn't explain why. I visited him in jail once, just once. The facility was cold and sterile, smelling of industrial disinfectant and despair. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. His usual swagger replaced by a shuffling gait as the guard led him to the visiting booth. When he saw me, he started crying immediately, begged me to help him, said he didn't remember what happened that night, said he'd been blackout hammered and high. I just sat there, staring at him through the glass, feeling nothing but emptiness. His tears seemed performative, his desperation calculated. Or maybe I just couldn't let myself believe him anymore. When I got back to the apartment that evening, I found my dad sitting alone in the dark. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week, new lines etched around his mouth and eyes, his hair seeming grayer than before. I sat down next to him, not saying anything at first. Then he started talking about Jack as a little kid, about how bright and funny he was before everything went wrong, how he'd been reading at 4, solving complex puzzles, charming everyone he met. I listened, feeling this weird mix of anger and pity. The father I'd resented for years suddenly seemed as much a victim as the rest of us. Dad finally admitted something I'd never heard before. Jack had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder when he was 14. My parents had kept it from me and Oscar, thinking they were protecting us. They'd tried to get him help, but Jack refused to take his meds consistently. Then he started self-medicating with alcohol and substances. The situation spiraled from there. Dad's voice cracked as he described taking Jack to different doctors, trying different medications, the brief periods of hope followed by crushing disappointments. I was furious they'd hidden this from us. Told my dad we had a right to know, especially since we were living with Jack's unpredictable behavior. Dad just nodded, tears streaming down his face. Said they'd made so many mistakes. I couldn't argue with that. The secrets had only made everything worse, created this atmosphere where we all pretended things were normal when they were anything but. The next day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Amber. My heart nearly stopped. She wanted to meet, said she needed to talk to someone who understood Jack. I agreed immediately, suggested a coffee shop near her hotel. My hands trembled as I got dressed, unsure what I could possibly say to her. When I saw her, I almost didn't recognize her. Melissa's little sister had always been this bubbly, outgoing girl with a big smile. The person sitting across from me looked hollow. Her eyes were dull, with dark circles underneath like bruises. She fidgeted constantly, jumping at every loud noise in the cafe. I wanted to hug her but knew better than to try. Instead, I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, trying to absorb its warmth. Amber asked me questions about Jack, about his history, his problems, whether he'd ever hurt anyone before. I told her everything I knew, including what my dad had just revealed about the bipolar diagnosis. She listened intently, sometimes nodding, sometimes wiping away tears. Her fingers traced patterns in the condensation on her water glass, never still for a moment. Before we parted, Amber told me something that chilled me to the bone. She said Jack had somehow gotten word to her through another inmate who was being released. This inmate had approached her outside the courthouse and delivered Jack's message. If she testified against him, he'd find her when he got out. Her voice shook as she repeated his threats, the specific graphic things he'd promised to do to her. I immediately called the detective handling the case. They promised to look into it, said Jack would lose visitation privileges, but the damage was already done. I could see the fear had taken root in Amber, another violation she'd have to carry. When I got back to the apartment, I found my mom packing Jack's things into boxes. His ratty band t-shirts, his collection of lighters, the participation trophies he'd never cared about. She said his lawyer thought it would look better to the judge if Jack had a stable living situation to return to if he made bail. I lost it. Started throwing the boxes across the room. Told her Jack was never setting foot in this apartment again, not while Oscar and I were there. That she was delusional if she thought he was coming home after what he'd done. Mom slapped me. Hard. First time she'd ever hit me as an adult. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. We both stood there in shock, her handprint blooming red on my cheek. Then she crumpled to the floor, sobbing. I left her there and went to find Oscar. He was in our old room, sitting on his bed with headphones on, staring at the wall. I tapped his shoulder and he jumped like I'd electrocuted him. His eyes were wide with panic until he recognized me. We went for a walk, ended up at this little park we used to go to as kids, sat on the swings not really talking at first, the chains creaking rhythmically as we pushed ourselves back and forth. The playground looked smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling, the slide dented. Then Oscar opened up, told me Jack had been threatening him for years. Little things at first, taking his stuff, making him do Jack's chores. Then it escalated to blackmail. Jack caught Oscar smoking devil's lettuce once and used it to make him steal money from our parents. Threatened to tell them about Oscar's boyfriend if he didn't comply. I was stunned. Asked why he never told me. Oscar said he was ashamed. Thought I'd be disappointed in him. I hugged him so tight, promised I'd never be disappointed in him for being victimized by Jack. We made a pact right there on those swings. No more secrets between us. No more protecting each other from the truth. The rusty chains dug into my palms as I gripped them, making the promise I should have made years ago. The day before Jack's hearing, his lawyer called our parents, said they were offering a plea deal, 5 years instead of 15. But Jack was refusing it, insisted he was innocent despite all the evidence, said Amber was lying. My parents were frantic, begging me to talk to him, convince him to take the deal. Mom's eyes were wild, desperate. Dad kept running his hands through his hair until it stood up in gray tufts. I refused at first, told them Jack made his choices and now had to face the consequences. But then I thought about Oscar, about how having this drag out would affect him, about the toll a trial would take on Amber and the other victims. So I agreed to try, for Oscar's sake, not Jack's. Not for my parents, who still couldn't see how they'd contributed to this disaster. The jail was cold and smelled like industrial cleaner mixed with sweat and despair. Jack looked even worse than before, twitchy, angry. His eyes darted around the room, never settling on my face for long. When I mentioned the plea deal, he exploded. Started yelling that I was betraying him, that I never loved him, that I always thought I was better than him. His spittle hit the glass partition between us as he ranted, his face contorted with rage. I just sat there, letting him rant. When he finally ran out of steam, I leaned forward and told him I knew about the threats to Amber. His face changed instantly, went from rage to this calculating look I'd seen 1,000 times before, the mask slipping to reveal the manipulator beneath. He denied it at first, then tried to justify it, said he was just scared, that he wasn't thinking clearly, that he'd never hurt her. He just wanted her to drop the charges. I stood up to leave, and that's when he grabbed my arm through the little opening in the partition. Squeezed so hard I knew it would bruise. A guard rushed over and pulled him back. As they were dragging him away, Jack shouted that if he was going down, he was taking everyone with him, that he had dirt on all of us. His eyes were wild, almost feral, as he thrashed against the guard's grip. I left shaking, called Oscar immediately to warn him. Jack had always been manipulative, but this was different. This was desperation, and desperate people do desperate things. I could still feel Jack's fingers digging into my arm, 5 points of pain that would bloom into bruises by morning. That night, someone broke into Melissa's hotel room. Nothing was taken, but Amber's clothes were cut to shreds. Little pieces scattered across the bed like confetti. The police said it was probably just a random break-in, but we all knew better. Jack had connections on the outside. Substance dealers, other addicts, people who'd do favors for future payment. The hotel's security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the time of the break-in. I insisted Melissa and Amber stay with my friend Tara, who had a security system and lived in a gated community. They agreed, too scared to argue. I spent the night making calls, warning everyone I could think of who might be targeted by Jack or his friends. My voice grew hoarse as I explained the situation over and over, each call making the reality of our situation more concrete. The morning of the hearing, I woke up to find our apartment door ajar. Nothing seemed missing at first. Then I noticed Oscar's laptop was gone, and my old diary from high school, the one where I'd written about all the family secrets, about Mom's abuse, Dad's neglect, Jack's escalating behavior. The leather-bound journal had been hidden in a shoebox at the back of my closet. Whoever took it knew exactly where to look. Oscar was panicking, said he had private photos on that laptop. Nothing illegal, just embarrassing stuff he didn't want anyone to see. Pictures of him and his boyfriend, private messages, journal entries about his sexuality that he wasn't ready to share with our parents. I tried to calm him down, said we'd figure it out. Inside, I was terrified. If Jack got his hands on my diary, he could twist everything I'd written to make me look unreliable, to discredit me if I testified. We reported the break-in, but the police didn't seem very interested. Just another burglary in LA. They took a report and left, barely looking around the apartment. We headed to the courthouse, both of us constantly checking our phones, worried about what might show up online. The morning traffic crawled along, each red light an eternity of anxiety. The courthouse was packed. Turns out Amber wasn't Jack's first victim. 2 other women had come forward after seeing his arrest in the news. College girls who'd been too scared to report him before. They sat together in the front row, holding hands, their faces set with determination. The prosecutor looked confident. Jack's lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, his tie askew, his briefcase overflowing with disorganized papers. Jack was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. He spotted me and Oscar in the gallery and smirked. Actually smirked. I felt sick. This wasn't my brother anymore. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Someone who enjoyed causing pain. I grabbed Oscar's hand, needing something to anchor me as the room seemed to tilt. The hearing itself was brief. Jack changed his plea to guilty at the last minute. The judge set a sentencing date for the following month. As they led Jack out, he looked back at me and mouthed something. I couldn't tell what it was, but it made Oscar grab my hand so tight it hurt. The bailiff's keys jangled as Jack was escorted out, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet courtroom. Outside the courthouse, a guy I didn't recognize approached us, tall, skinny, with tattoos crawling up his neck. One of Jack's friends from his dealing days. He handed me a note and walked away before I could say anything. The note just said, "Check your email. Jay says you have 24 hours to get him out or everything goes public." I checked my email on my phone. There it was. Screenshots of my diary, Oscar's private photos, even a video I'd never seen before of my mom hitting me when I was about 10. Her face contorted with rage as she slapped me for spilling juice on the carpet. The email threatened to send everything to our extended family, our employers, our schools, everyone. Oscar and I sat in my car, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't get Jack out. He'd pled guilty. And even if we could, we wouldn't. He belonged in prison. But the thought of all our private pain being exposed made me physically ill. Oscar kept biting his nails, a nervous habit from childhood returning under stress. The car felt too small, too hot, despite the cool November air outside. I decided to go to the prosecutor. Told her everything. Showed her the email. She was sympathetic but firm. Said this was witness intimidation and would only make things worse for Jack. Advised us to ignore the threats. Easy for her to say. It wasn't her life that would be ruined. Wasn't her secrets being used as weapons? She promised to add the blackmail attempt to Jack's charges, but that did little to ease our immediate fear. When we got home, my parents were waiting. Someone had already sent them the video of Mom hitting me. Dad was white as a sheet. Mom was hysterical, alternating between apologizing and blaming me for saving the video to use against her. I tried to explain I hadn't saved it, that Jack must have been recording us for years, collecting ammunition. The living room felt like a pressure cooker, everyone's emotions threatening to explode. That night, Oscar and I made a decision. We weren't going to be blackmailed. We'd take control of the narrative ourselves. I called my closest friends, told them everything. The abuse, the dysfunction, Jack's crimes. Oscar did the same with his friends. We posted lockdown social media statements acknowledging that we came from a troubled home but were breaking the cycle of abuse. My hands shook as I typed out my post, but with each word, I felt a little lighter. It was terrifying, exposing our family's darkest secrets, but also weirdly freeing. No more pretending. No more covering for our parents. No more protecting Jack from consequences. No more lies. The truth sat between us like a third person, uncomfortable but necessary. The next day, the promised exposé dropped. Jack's friends had created a website with all our private information, but it fell flat. We'd already told our truth. The people who mattered to us already knew, and strangers on the internet, who cared what they thought? The site got some traffic, but most people saw it for what it was, a desperate attempt at revenge by a guilty man. The prosecutor added witness intimidation and blackmail to Jack's charges. His sentencing would likely be even harsher now. My parents were furious with Oscar and me, said we'd destroyed the family by airing our dirty laundry. I reminded them that Jack was the one who'd collected and distributed the evidence, that he was the one who'd assaulted 3 women, that he was the one who'd been terrorizing us for years while they looked the other way. Dad just walked out of the room. Mom threw a glass against the wall, the shards catching the light as they fell. Mom moved out that night, said she needed space, packed a suitcase and went to stay with her sister in San Diego. Dad stayed but barely spoke to us, moved like a ghost through the apartment, going to work, coming home, eating silently, retreating to his bedroom. Oscar and I didn't care. We had each other. And for the first time, we had the truth out in the open. No more secrets festering in the dark. A week later, I got a call from Amber. She'd seen our posts, wanted to thank us for standing up to Jack, for believing her, for not trying to protect him like so many families do. We met for coffee again, and this time she seemed stronger. Still traumatized, but determined to heal. Her hands were steady as she lifted her cup, her eyes clearer than before. I went back to my apartment to pack up more of my things. I decided to take a semester off, stay in LA until Jack's sentencing, make sure Oscar was okay. As I was going through my old room, I found something tucked behind the radiator. A small notebook I didn't recognize, its cover worn, the pages yellowed with age. It was Jack's journal from when he was 13. I sat on my old bed and read the whole thing in one sitting. It was heartbreaking. He wrote about hearing voices, about feeling like his brain was on fire, about being scared all the time, about how he started drinking to quiet the noise in his head. His handwriting changed from page to page, sometimes neat and controlled, other times frantic scribbles that tore through the paper. There was one entry that hit me hardest. He wrote about breaking my bike, said he did it because he was jealous, because Dad never taught him to ride a bike, because he wanted me to hurt like he was hurting. I cried for the little boy who wrote those words, for the brother I never really got to know, for the man he became and the lives he destroyed, including his own. I showed the journal to my dad. He broke down completely, said they'd tried to get Jack help, but the mental health system was a maze they couldn't navigate, said they'd spent thousands on treatments that didn't work, said they'd been afraid Jack would hurt himself if they pushed too hard. Dad's shoulders shook with sobs as he confessed their failures, their fear, their misguided attempts to protect us all. I understood their fear better now, but it didn't excuse what they'd allowed to happen. Their failure to protect Oscar and me, their enabling of Jack's worst behaviors, their denial about how dangerous he'd become. The damage was done, and no amount of understanding could undo it. The day before Jack's sentencing, I visited him one last time, brought the journal, asked him if he remembered writing it. He seemed surprised I'd found it, said he thought he'd burned it years ago. For a moment, I saw a flash of the brother I used to know, vulnerable, human. His fingers traced the cover gently, as if greeting an old friend. I told Jack I was sorry the adults in his life had failed him, that he hadn't gotten the help he needed, but that I couldn't forgive what he'd done to Amber and the others, that I couldn't forgive how he'd terrorized Oscar, that actions have consequences, no matter what demons drive them. My voice was steady, even as my heart ached for what might have been. Jack listened silently. When I finished, he pushed the journal back across the table to me, said I should keep it, said maybe someday I'd understand him better. I took it, not sure if it was a peace offering or just another manipulation. The worn cover felt heavy in my hands, weighted with all our shared history. As I stood to leave, Jack asked if I'd be at the sentencing tomorrow. I told him I would, but I'd be sitting with Amber and the other victims. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Said he had one more thing to tell me before I went. His eyes met mine, clear and focused for the first time in years. That's when Jack revealed his final, most devastating secret. One that would change everything I thought I knew about our family. "Dad isn't your real father," Jack said, his voice flat. "Mom had an affair with her boss. That's why Dad always worked so much. He couldn't stand looking at you." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Jack just watched me, his face unreadable. "You're lying," I managed to say. But even as the words left my mouth, I remembered things. Dad's emotional distance. The way he'd look at me sometimes with this weird sadness. How much closer he seemed to Jack and Oscar. Jack shrugged. "Ask Mom if you don't believe me. She told me when I was 15. Said I needed to protect the family secret because I was the only one she could trust." He laughed, a hollow sound that bounced off the concrete walls. "Funny, right? Trusting me with anything." I left without another word. My legs felt like they were moving through water as I walked to my car. I sat there for almost an hour, just staring at nothing, trying to process what Jack had told me. Was it true? Or just one final attempt to hurt me, to throw our family into even more chaos? I called Oscar, told him to meet me at the diner near our apartment. I needed neutral ground for this conversation. When he showed up, he looked worried. I must have looked like hell. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and told him what Jack had said. Oscar didn't seem surprised. That's what shocked me most. He just nodded slowly, stirring his milkshake with a straw. "I kind of figured something like that," he finally said. "I found some old letters once, from someone named Robert to Mom. They were pretty intense. I felt betrayed all over again." "And you never told me?" "I wasn't sure," Oscar said, defensive. "And then I forgot about it. It was years ago, Hannah. I was like 12. We sat in silence for a while. The diner buzzed around us. People laughing, eating, living normal lives. Must be nice. "We should ask Dad," I finally said. "Before the sentencing tomorrow. We deserve to know the truth." Oscar looked terrified, but nodded. We paid and drove home in silence. Dad was watching TV when we got there, some old Western with the volume too low to actually hear. He looked up when we walked in, his eyes tired. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "About Mom, about Robert, about who my real father is." Dad's face went completely white. He fumbled for the remote and turned off the TV. For a second, I thought he might deny it, but he just sighed and seemed to shrink into the couch. "Jack told you," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Dad rubbed his face with both hands. "I wanted to tell you so many times. Your mother wouldn't let me. Said it would destroy you. Destroy us all." "So it's true?" My voice cracked. Dad nodded. "Robert was her boss at the insurance company. The affair lasted about 6 months. When she got pregnant, she ended it. Told me everything. I decided to stay. To raise you as my own." "But you didn't," I said, anger rising in my throat. "You were barely there. You worked all the time. You let Mom treat me like garbage." "I know," Dad whispered. "I thought I could do it. Be your father. But every time I looked at you, I saw him. I saw her betrayal. I'm so sorry, Hannah. I failed you completely." I wanted to scream at him, to throw things, to make him feel a fraction of the pain and confusion I was feeling. But looking at him, this broken old man with nothing left but regrets, I just felt empty. "Does Oscar know?" I asked, suddenly worried. "Is he—" "Oscar is mine," Dad said quickly. "Biologically, I mean. By the time he came along, your mother and I had worked through some things." Oscar was sitting silently through all this, his face unreadable. I reached for his hand and he squeezed mine hard. "What about Jack?" I asked. "Is he yours?" Dad nodded. "Jack is mine, but he had problems from the beginning. The doctor said it was just colic at first, but he never stopped crying, never slept. As he got older, it just got worse. The mood swings, the anger. We took him to so many doctors, tried so many medications." "That doesn't excuse how you let him treat us," Oscar said suddenly, his voice hard. "You let him terrorize us for years." Dad started crying then, actually sobbing. I'd never seen him cry before. Not when Grandma died, not when Jack was arrested. Never. "I know," he kept saying between sobs. "I know." We left him there on the couch and went to my old room, sat on the floor with our backs against the bed, just like we used to do as kids when things got too intense in the rest of the apartment. "What do we do now?" Oscar asked, sounding younger than his 20 years. I shook my head. "I don't know. Go to the sentencing tomorrow. Try to process all this. Keep moving forward somehow." We stayed like that for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. Around midnight, Oscar fell asleep with his head on my shoulder. I carefully moved him to the bed and covered him with a blanket. Then I went to the kitchen for some water. Dad was still on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. He looked up when I entered. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "About Jack. About why your mother and I were so protective of him." I sat down across from him, bracing myself for more revelations. "When Jack was 17, he tried to K*L himself," Dad said, his voice barely audible. "Pills. We found him just in time. The doctors said it was our fault for not getting him proper treatment sooner, for trying to handle it ourselves. After that, we couldn't bear to be strict with him. We were so afraid he'd try again." I thought about all the times Jack had manipulated them, used their fear to get what he wanted, the money, the freedom, the lack of consequences. "He used that against you," I said. "He knew exactly what buttons to push." Dad nodded miserably. "We knew what he was doing. We just didn't know how to stop it without losing him completely." I felt a confusing mix of emotions. Anger at my parents for their failures, pity for the impossible situation they'd found themselves in, sadness for Jack and the demons he'd been fighting his whole life, and underneath it all, a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally out. All of it. No more secrets. "I'm going to bed," I said, suddenly exhausted. "We have court in the morning." Dad nodded. "Hannah," he called as I was leaving the room, "I do love you. I've always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it properly." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Just went back to my room and curled up on the floor next to Oscar's bed, listening to his steady breathing until I finally fell asleep. The courthouse was packed the next morning. More victims had come forward overnight, 5 women in total now. Jack's crimes had made the local news. There were reporters outside with cameras, asking for statements as we pushed past them into the building. Amber and Melissa were already inside, sitting with the other victims. Amber looked up when I entered, her eyes questioning. I nodded slightly, letting her know I was there for her, not Jack. She gave me a small smile and turned back to the front. Jack was brought in looking even worse than before. Pale, thin, dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me, he smirked again, thinking his revelation had destroyed me. I stared back, my face neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction. The sentencing was quick. The judge was harsh, calling Jack a predator who had shown no remorse. 15 years. No possibility of early parole. Jack's face didn't change as the sentence was read. He just stared straight ahead, like none of this was happening to him. As they let him out, he looked back at me one last time. I thought he might try to say something, make one last attempt to hurt me, but he just looked lost. For a second, I saw the little boy from the journal, the one who was scared and in pain. Then the guards led him through the door, and he was gone. Outside the courthouse, I approached Amber, asked if we could talk. We sat on a bench away from the crowd. I told her everything, about Jack's mental illness, about my parents' failures, about the family secrets that had just come to light. Not to excuse what Jack had done, but to give her the context she'd asked for. "Thank you for telling me," she said when I finished. "It doesn't change anything, doesn't make it hurt less, but it helps to understand." I nodded. "I know. I just wanted you to have the whole picture." "What will you do now?" she asked. I hadn't really thought about it. "Go back to school, I guess. Try to finish my degree. Help Oscar get through this. Figure out who I am now that everything I thought I knew about myself has changed." Amber reached over and squeezed my hand briefly. "For what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you realize, you and Oscar both." I thanked her, feeling awkward but grateful. We exchanged numbers, promised to keep in touch. Not friends exactly, but connected by something neither of us had chosen. Oscar was waiting by the car. "Can we get out of here?" he asked, eyeing the reporters who were still hanging around. We drove to the beach, sat on the sand watching the waves. It was a clear day, the ocean stretching out endlessly before us. Oscar skipped rocks while I just sat, letting the sun warm my face. "I'm not going back to that apartment," Oscar said suddenly. "I can't live there anymore. Not with them. Not after everything." "Where will you go?" I asked. He shrugged. "Get a place with some friends, maybe. I've been saving from my campus job." I thought about my tiny studio apartment back at school, the scholarship that barely covered my expenses, the part-time job that ate into my study time. "What if we got a place together?" I suggested. "Not now, but after I graduate next year. Somewhere halfway between your school and wherever I end up working. We could split the rent." Oscar's face lit up. "You mean it? You'd want to live with me?" "Of course I would," I said, surprised by his reaction. "You're the only family I've got that matters." He hugged me then, a real hug, not the awkward pat on the back he usually gave. "Same," he mumbled into my shoulder. We stayed at the beach until sunset, making plans. Practical stuff like budgets and locations, but also fun things. Movie nights, getting a dog maybe, having friends over for dinner. Normal things that had never been normal for us. When we finally went back to the apartment, Mom was there. She'd driven up from San Diego after hearing about the sentencing on the news. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back. Her face crumpled, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. "I know you hate me right now," she said, her voice small. "I don't blame you." "I don't hate you," I said, surprised to find it was true. "I just don't trust you, and I don't want to live in the past anymore." I told her about our plan, me and Oscar getting a place together after graduation. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. "I hope someday you can forgive me." I didn't answer that. Couldn't promise something I wasn't sure was possible. Instead, I went to my room and started packing. I had a flight back to school the next day, classes to catch up on, a life to rebuild. Oscar helped me carry my bags to the car in the morning. Mom and Dad stood awkwardly in the doorway, not sure what to say or do. I gave them each a stiff hug, more for closure than affection. "I'll call when I land," I told Oscar, hugging him tightly. "And we'll talk every week, make plans, figure things out." He nodded, trying to look tough, but I could see he was fighting back tears. "Go be awesome," he said. "I'll be fine here until you're done with school." I believed him. Oscar was stronger than anyone gave him credit for, stronger than I'd been at his age. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Oscar was still standing there, waving. Mom and Dad had gone back inside. The apartment building looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than it had when I was growing up. I turned on the radio and rolled down the windows, letting the cool morning air rush in. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. The future was uncertain, full of challenges I couldn't predict. But it was mine to shape, mine and Oscar's. Jack had tried to destroy us with his secrets. Instead, he'd set us free.